I'm really excited about this webinar, actually. It's mainly because I'm hoping to learn quite a lot myself about the data recording and how to record data, how to record wildlife. So I'd like to thank Natalie from the Wildlife Information Centre for coming along tonight. That's despite having been surviving two weeks of unexpected jury service. So well done, Natalie, and thank you very much. And I think one of the brilliant things about working in planning democracy is the sharing of knowledge that happens within our network. And I've actually met our other two speakers through our work with communities. And there's so much skill and enthusiasm in the PD network. So I'd like to thank both Kat and Aimée for coming along to share their knowledge with us. So tonight's session is going to be building on last month's webinar, which explained the importance of biological data and the ecologist's role in surveying development sites, writing environmental reports, and the importance of having good ecological data to draw from. We also found out where the biological data is kept with the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, or NBN Atlas, who uses the data, and more importantly, the importance of the volunteers to contribute to this vital data source. So this webinar is really more orientated to what you can do. And our speakers are going to explain how to record nature, how to get your records verified and put onto the all-important NBN Atlas and so on. And that helps inform development plans and planning decisions. So our speakers will show you how to get support and help to do this as well. Because you never know what's out there, do you? I just had a great experience today where I was out in the woods where I live, and I bumped into a lichen expert, and he'd actually just recorded some lichens in our beech woods outside, and one of them was a notable species, and it wasn't supposed to be there, if you like, but it was, and he was quite excited about that. And if he hadn't been there recording it, we'd know, who would have known that it was there? But it's now going to go onto the, into the records and so on. So I think that's really important for this webinar. So our first speaker is Natalie Harmsworth, and she's from the centre, the Wildlife Information Centre. She's the centre manager there. And that's the local environmental record centre, and they collect and disseminate information on wildlife in southeast and part of central Scotland. And Natalie has previously worked as a contract ecologist with the Somerset Wildlife Trust, and she's also distinguished herself by being top student whilst studying environmental sciences and environmental conservation to a master's degree level. And at the Wildlife Information Centre, also known as TWIC, Natalie has overall responsibility for the management and development of the record centre and the staff and the volunteers. So I'm going to hand over to Natalie now. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thanks ever so much for inviting me this evening to give this talk. In the next 20 minutes, I'll be covering, giving you an overview really of what record centres do, how we use data, and with particular sort of reference to planning decisions. I know that's something I'm particularly interested in, and really how you can get involved, how you can help with collecting wildlife records. So, to begin with, if I just give you an overview of who we are, TWIC. So TWIC is the local environmental record centre for South East and Central Scotland, as Claire said. The map shows the area we cover. So we actually cover 8 local authorities plus the national park, so the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park. And we aim to provide high quality data services to a wide range of data users to inform both conservation action, but also environmental decision making. And we gather that data from a wide range of sources, so everything from one-off sightings from the members of the public to large national data sets from recording schemes, and also the atlas, the MBN atlas. So once we've drawn all that information together, it gets entered into our central database from whence we can supply that to our data users. Currently, our database holds over 4 million species records, so it's a substantial data set for the Twick area. Another key part of our role really is supporting and promoting wildlife recording, and we do that through our events and training program. In terms of us as staff and how we're funded, so we are a charity and we're a company limited by guarantee. We're managed by a board of directors who are trustees, and those are voluntary posts. So we're an independent organisation. We have currently 5 members of staff, 3 of which are part-time, and that's equivalent to 3.5 full-time equivalents. So in terms of our funding, we benefit from a grant from Nature Scott, but really the bulk of our funding comes from service level agreements with the local authorities. And those agreements are for the delivery of certain services. We also gain income from data searches from consultants. We undertake project work, and we have memberships and donations as well. So that's just a bit about us as an organisation. So as you know, there's a network of record centres throughout the UK and in Scotland. I think I spotted Lindsay possibly in the audience, so from Fife Nature. So Twick is a member of ALEC, which is the Association of Local Environmental Record Centres. And we're also a member of the MBN, so we're part of the National Biodiversity Network. So most record centres are either regional or cover a single local authority area. But in Scotland, we actually don't have full coverage of record centres. And so this was identified as a particular issue as part of the SPIF review, which I think you've heard from Christine Tansey previously from the MBN Trust. And so this is really one of the issues we're currently trying to grapple with to make sure really we've got service coverage across Scotland. And that's one of the aims of the current BBD project, because data are critical to making informed decisions. So if you ever want to know, is there a record centre for my area? Where can I find out the information? Then I would recommend to find an LERC map, which is on ALEC's website, and that's what you see on the screen, a screenshot from that site. So you can look up to see who your centre is and get in touch with them. So in terms of data provision, Twick supplies data to a wide range of individuals and organisations, and that covers a range of different types of data sets. So everything from species data sets, habitat data, to designated sites information. And as I've said, we collect that data from as wide a range of sources as possible, and we do that through data sharing agreements with different organisations. In terms of the actual data we provide, so typically we get requested notable and protected species data, also invasive species, but in some cases people just want to know what's on their site, so they may request all species records. And in terms of habitat data, a wide range again, so phase 1 habitat data, the habitat map of Scotland, ancient trees, ancient woodland layers, native woodland survey of Scotland. So again, a wide range of data sets we can provide, and again in a variety of sort of different formats. So Twick actually hosts some designated sites information. We actually manage the local designated sites for most of the local authorities in our area. That's the local biodiversity sites. So we are the provider of the site citations or the site statements for those sites. And those outline what the interest is for those sites. But we also provide statutory designated sites as well. So in terms of data use, typically ecological consultants request our data to inform planning applications, and increasingly forestry agents are coming to us as well for data in support of woodland grant applications. So these, but consultants and forestry agents come to us for data, and that really helps inform their site reports, but also in terms of what data they're collecting as part of field surveys. So it's really helpful to do that bit of background research before you actually go out on the site, because it may flag potential issues at an early stage, things they need to follow up. So typically, consultants would request a data search for a site plus a certain buffer. Typically, they tend to ask for a 2-kilometre buffer, but it can vary depending on the application, what it is, and what particular groups they feel might be impacted. We also provide data for a wide range of other users, so anything from members of the public, so just people wanting to know what's in my backyard, but also recorders and researchers. So if you're going out, say, to look for northern brown argus, it might be useful to know where your rock rose plants are, for example. We also get a lot of data searches from students who are actually ecology students, and they're often asked to do mock assessments, mock EIAs. And so they come to TWIC for data as part of their assignments. So you'll see on the screen some data. So that's just a little screenshot from GIS, which shows a buffer. So in this case, 100 meters around Bogrie, which is where TWIC used to be TWIC used to be based. And you can see the records. So the records are those squares. So they relate to the grid references for those particular sightings. So you can see which data are particularly relevant to that site. So I mentioned at the start that local authorities are one of our main users or funders. And so through service level agreements, so annual or maybe 3-year agreements, we provide certain services. And this is a list of the different services we typically provide to local authorities. It's really up to the local authorities how many they go for, and it might depend partly on how much ecology expertise they've got in-house. But I'm going to run through those, 2 in particular, which I think are particularly pertinent. So the first one, notable and protected species. So we provide a layer, so it's a GIS layer. So we've seen on the last slide data. So this is the type of data we provide for the local authority area in which they're based. So it's all species with some kind of status. So it could be local rarities, it could be nationally rare species, anything with some kind of designation or protection. And we provide that as a layer which the local authority can use throughout the year for internal decision making. So they can reference that layer whenever they need it. And so they pay for a license to obtain that data set. And they typically get 2 updates a year, because obviously we're adding new data all the time to our database. The second main use that local authorities make of record centres, or TWIC in particular, is planning application screening. So in this case, the local authority provides us with a shapefile which has the boundaries of all the week's planning applications. They could be quite small, so homeowner applications right through to the larger developments. They provide us with that boundary layer. We then screen it against the biodiversity data we hold. What we screen it against really depends what the local authorities decided in terms of what criteria they want for the screening. So it could be anything from habitat, species, designated sites data. And they can request additional data sets as well. So for example, bug life have a beelines data set, so that's one we've added recently. And the Woodland Trust have their ancient tree inventory, so we added that as well when that became available. So really, we can add any data sets that the council wants that we can access. And for some data sets, like species data sets, they might be quite particular about what they want, what they're looking for. So for example, they might not want all badger records, they might just want the set records. And similarly for things like bats, they may prefer just to receive the bat roost or hibernacular records rather than just bat sighting, a flyover. So they can stipulate what criteria they want us to use to screen planning applications against. So once we've agreed what the criteria are, we as I say, we screen their list weekly, and the output is what you see on the screen. So it's a report, a PDF report. It will have the application number, what it is, the application description, and a list of potential biodiversity constraints. These are species, habitat, sites that might be impacted by that particular development. This one's made up, I should say. But you can see one of the things that I wanted to draw your attention to, which perhaps we'll pick up later, is you'll see the grid references for the species sightings. These are all 6-figure grid references. So the majority of local authorities would only use for planning screening the most precise records. So those with 100-meter square resolution or better records. So that's the 6-figure grid references. So things at kilometre square, 2 kilometre wouldn't be included in these reports. And that's just to make sure they're just including the records that are most relevant to their sites. They still have in most cases, the notable layers that they can reference if they want to, which would include other records. But that's the way we've done it. It's just worth bearing in mind that these reports, they show the records that we hold, but it's always worth bearing in mind with the records that the absence of a record does not mean that that species is absent at that site. So once you produce these reports, it's really up to the staff and the council to interpret them. So using their ecology expertise, assess, first of all, will the application, depending on what it is, have an impact on these features? Because depending on what it is, it may not have any impact. And also looking at, well, perhaps looking at the habitats present, are there other species perhaps not flagged in the report that might be present and potentially impacted by the development works? So that's where interpretation comes in. So that's where the local authority staff would then input. So TWIC, generally speaking, provides the data, and the local authority provides the interpretation side and makes a decision on what survey work, if any, is needed prior to them determining the planning application. So these reports are also really useful in terms of looking at things like biodiversity enhancement, because it might flag perhaps the presence of a species. For example, it could be there are screaming swifts or swift nests in the local area. So things like putting in swift nest boxes might be really worthwhile in that particular area because they're already known to be present in that area. And just finally to say, I've highlighted that the interpretation is needed. Not all local authorities have the in-house ecology expertise. So in fact, in one local authority in our area, TWIC actually provides that sort of enhanced service. So we provide some interpretation comments on these reports. So there's a couple of other ways that local authorities use data from TWIC. So particularly local biodiversity action plans. So where they're looking to make priority species lists, for example, using the data sets held by the Record Centre are really valuable for working out what should be on those lists. And also looking at things like monitoring. So are there data sets that can help us show how effective the LBAPs are being in terms of delivering biodiversity? So that's perhaps more of a future thing, but certainly there's potential to be using these data more and doing more sort of work on sort of state of nature type reporting. So that's something really for the future. Finally, sort of local development plans. So again, you can screen those sites against the data held by the Record Centre to potentially flag up if there are important sites or species habitats that might be impacted, and to perhaps help the local authorities make decisions on where new development sites ought to be on a more widespread and strategic basis. I've put local biodiversity sites in there as well, because local biodiversity sites or local nature conservation sites are shown in local development plans. And TWIC, as a record centre, manages the systems for the majority of the local authorities in our area. And that's something I want to touch on a bit more. So if you haven't heard of local biodiversity sites before, or local nature conservation sites, these are local designated sites. So you might have heard of local wildlife sites, for example. So these are basically the same thing, but this is a new name and a new system. So there's national guidance on how these systems should be set up and managed. And NatureScot provided that guidance and in fact updated it just last year. So you can go on their website to read that. TWIC set up a system some years ago, and it's been adopted, as I say, by most of the local authorities in our area. And so we now manage those systems on behalf of the respective local authorities. So the process goes from identifying the sites through to setting the criteria for how we assess whether a site meets the standard for an LBS, through to organising survey work and then running assessments. Once it's gone through that process, it can be adopted, and generally speaking, most local authorities do that via their local development plan. But we don't do this alone, so it's not just TWIC and the local authority. Each local authority has a steering group, and that comprises representatives from local conservation organisations and local experts as well. So there's an extra level of scrutiny to make sure the process is robust. And we have a set of standardised criteria for how we assess a site, how decide whether it meets the standard. And those cover 5 different biodiversity criteria. I won't go into that into too much detail. It could be a whole talk on by itself, but just to flag that it's an important part of how local authorities use TWIC data. So just to add really finally on the LBS side of things, there is, unlike SSSIs, which are a representative suite of sites, any site that meets the criteria can be designated an LBS, unless there's some other reason why it couldn't be considered. For example, if it's already designated for development in the local development plan, the local authority may be reluctant to add it. But otherwise, generally speaking, if there's an area which has value and there's good reason for adding it, you can put it forward as a new site. And there is a process for proposing sites. If there are sites you're aware of that you feel should be included. And if you would be best to check with the individual local authorities how to do that, or come to TWIC and we can advise you for those that we work with in our area. There are hundreds of sites in the TWIC area, so over 800 sites across our area. So really it makes up a really excellent resource. And is an important part of nature networks as well. The changing direction slightly, I was asked to mention how we handle sensitive species data. So sensitive species are those that are vulnerable to either exploitation or persecution, and obvious examples would be badger sets and raptors particularly, where if you were to give out that information potentially to the wrong people, that there potentially could be harm resulting from the release of that information. So it's something we take really seriously. There is national guidance on what is a sensitive species. So you can check NatureScot's website, where there's a list of all the different species that the experts and the national schemes and societies have agreed could be sensitive to either exploitation or persecution. And in those recommendations, it states at what resolution it's accepted that you can release publicly that information. So that's the guidance TWIC uses, and that's also used by the NBN Atlas Scotland as well, to blur the resolution of records because yeah, this is a public site. One thing to bear in mind is that for some species, it might be a particular stage that's sensitive. But practically, in terms of implementing the list, we tend to just blur by species. So we don't look at that sort of detail, but it is something to be aware of. There are some birds, for example, that are typically here in the winter, but they're sensitive during the breeding stage. So technically, the wintering records wouldn't be regarded as sensitive. So in terms of how TWIC handles this on a day-to-day basis, so for public data requests, we would automatically blur any records of sensitive species. And by blur, I mean reduce the resolution of the grid reference. So for something like badgers, we'd only give it out at 2 kilometre resolution. And we generally remove the location name as well, because often that would reveal the location of the set, for example. However, we know that in the majority of cases, it's better to give out as much information as possible. So, and there are reasons why you would need that information. So planning decisions, for example. So for local authorities and for ecological consultants, they would receive the full resolution data from us. But by signing our terms of data supply, they would be agreeing to handling sensitive species information appropriately. So for consultants, for example, that would mean either putting those data in confidential annexes or marking their report as confidential, so that it's not uploaded to publicly available planning portals, for example. And that's something that SIEM also recommend and have guidelines for. So it is important that we follow the sensitive species rules. It's important for the species themselves, but it's also important for TWIC in terms of how our reputation, if you like, because data providers have to have the confidence that we're handling their data appropriately, and that those that we pass it on to are also doing similarly. So in terms of submitting data, I know that Aimée, I think, is covering the basics of recording in more detail, so I won't cover that. But I would just give you a bit of an overview of where to send your records, because I know it can be a bit confusing because there are so many different ways that you can actually get data into the system. What I would say is don't stress on it too much. You know, the key thing is that you submit your records. So don't worry too much about where you're sending it. I can give you some general recommendations. But the main thing is that you are doing it and you're not keeping it in your notebook in the cupboard in your house where it's doing no good whatsoever. So getting it into the system is the most important thing. And then hopefully we've got systems in place to ensure data are shared and they get to where they need to be. So in terms of some general recommendations, I would say if you are particularly keen on a particular group, so say you're an enthusiastic birder, then you should be sending your records to the recording scheme directly. The reason being is that they'll be better placed to support your development as a recorder. So they'll give you feedback on your records, and that will help you progress as a recorder. You'll learn your mistakes, and you'll be better for it. If you're a generalist, you might be preferable actually to send your records to the record centre, so TWIC, either in spreadsheet format or online, or use an online recording site like iRecord, which accepts records of all taxon groups. The good thing about iRecord is that both recording schemes and the record centres can access those records. So they do the hard work for you in terms of redistributing your records to where they need to get to. There's also lots of great phone apps. Again, I think Amy's covering these, but we would recommend particularly iRecord. Again, it's multi-taxers app, so you can do everything on it. And you can also upload photos, which is really helpful. So I just wanted to cover a few pointers to make sure that your records are as useful as possible, particularly bearing in mind we're talking about records informing planning decisions. So the main thing to do is to make sure you get this data into the system. Until it's into the system, we can't use it. To get it in, make sure if you're doing it in spreadsheet, make format, make sure you submit your records at least annually. If you're using apps or online recording, it's pretty much instant. Grid references are important to bear in mind. So if you are recording something notable or protected, you'd be as well to assign a precise grid reference, so 100-meter square or better. If you're using a phone app, it will give you the GPS location, so it's quite simple. There's some really useful tools to help you with grid reference. So the Grab a Grid Reference tool, which is an online tool. There's also apps for your phone. The OS Locate app is free and it works both on Android and iPhone. And just finally, a little note about iNaturalist. So it's really important to check the license that you're assigning to your records. So this determines how your data can be used. And if you're wanting your data to be used for planning and local decision making, really you need to be assigning over one of these two licenses that you see on the screen. If you upload it under a CC BY NC license, record centres like TWIC cannot access those data. So that's really important to remember. And finally, just remember, if you can use your real name, that helps as well. It just helps the people that are checking the quality of the data. So if they know who you are, they know whether you're a reliable recorder or not. Using usernames just means that effectively they don't know who you are. So if you can use your real name, it's preferable. So I think I'm running out of time, but just to touch on that, TWIC runs a whole load of events and workshops to help support your recording. We've got a program of workshops coming up this winter into the spring, so keep an eye on our website for those. They'll be covering a variety of identification topics, some of which will be online. So even if you're not local to our area, you're welcome to come along and join us for those. And just a few final thoughts to take away with you. Recorders really can make a great difference by plugging gaps in our knowledge, but also potentially flagging sites that are of local importance for conservation, so your local biodiversity sites. And finally, just don't assume something's known. Even if it's a nature reserve, it may be that someone hasn't reported the species that you're spotting on your walk. So it's always worthwhile submitting a record, even if you think it's a popular site and other people have surely recorded it. So thanks very much, and I'll take any questions.
Thanks very much, Natalie. So for our next speaker is Aimée Moretti. Aimée has worked in a green health and wellbeing project that connects people experiencing mental health problems and with issues to nature. And she's currently a senior project officer at the Conservation Volunteers, which involves taking people on nature walks and delivering practical conservation tasks. She's active in her local community as well, previously volunteering for Cumbernauld Living Landscape and their Nature Ninjas as well. So she's very busy. And Aimée has developed skills in recording nature and is going to take you through how to go about this using iNaturalist and iRecorder, or just plain pen and paper.
So, hi everybody, my name is Aimée Moretti. Like Claire said, I'm a senior project officer with the Conservation Volunteers, and I work on the Seven Lochs Wetland Park project, if any of you know that. Outside of work, I'm also part of a local group in Cumbernauld called POPA, which stands for People Opposing the Palliserigg Planning Application. We're working to oppose a development in Cumbernauld that would destroy a site of special natural interest, including red listed species. And I'm going to share some information today about citizen science recording, what it is, what makes a good record, and how to do this as part of a community. So what is citizen science? If anyone hasn't heard this term before, I'll give you a very brief overview. If you're somebody who voluntarily contributes your time towards scientific research, whether for a specific project, like RSPB's Big Garden Birdwatch is a really popular one that a lot of people do. Or even if you just record things for the public domain using apps, then you are a citizen scientist. A lot of academic disciplines use data that is gathered through citizen science. This includes ecology and biology, like we were talking about, but also health and medical science, astronomy, history, and social sciences. One good thing about using citizen science is that it's totally free and anybody can take part. It's quite an accessible method of recording. You can be somebody that records the data and physically goes out into sites or into archives and things like that and makes these records, or you can be someone that sits at a laptop or on their phone and identifies and analyzes things that are being recorded by these other people. There's some examples at the end of websites where you can be the person identifying these things and saying, I think this is XYZ, or categorizing historic records. But just as a specific example, there's a website called Zooniverse, where there's a project based in Australia that needs people to take part in it, and they want you to type up the record of old prisoners. And the aim of this is to create a digital historic database. So it's not just for biological science, it's for a lot of things. Citizen science is a very vast category. So what makes a good record? Natalie from TWIC kind of touched on it during her presentation, but I'm just going to touch on it again just to really make sure that we're getting good records. So there's 4 main parts to consider: the who, what, when, and where. And if you have these 4 pieces of information within your record, then it makes it so much more reliable, and it shows that you've taken the time to identify something and not just snapped a picture, chucked it into an app and walked on. You've spent the time analysing it and making sure that the information you're sharing is as accurate as possible. So who, the individual who, or group, sorry, that submits the recording, and knowing this is what helps build trust and familiarity within recording communities, as Natalie said. It also, she touched on using your own name. This makes it easier to contact you or the community group if there's something very rare that has been spotted or something a bit questionable. What, you can use the common name or the scientific name. A lot of apps will use both, but if you know the scientific names, then that's, you know, your choice to use those. You can use, like I said, identification apps or books if you're confident in your ID, to make sure. Oh, sorry, I've mistyped something and it's confused me. Yeah, basically just try and record the Latin and the common name if you can. I'm not particularly well versed in my Latin names. I go for common names a lot, but a lot of apps will help you with that and include both. So the next part of information that you would need is when, the date and the time that the species was seen. It's especially useful if you're seeing something at a time where it wouldn't expect to be seen. So for example, if you recorded a hedgehog at 1 o'clock in the afternoon in the middle of winter when it should be hibernating, then the date and the time in that scenario can be quite valuable information, because that tells us that something's not quite right here, either with the climate or that specific individual hedgehog. Yeah, so the time and the date of when you have seen these, and you don't have to upload things automatically when you're in the field. You can go back, sit at a desk, and then upload them as well. Where have you seen this species? Where have you recorded it, or where have you heard it, if it's just birdsong that you're kind of focusing on? As previously mentioned, apps like OS Locate and What 3 Words can be really helpful in these scenarios, both of which are completely free apps. And obviously, in instances where the information is sensitive, it can be good to provide as much accurate information as you can, that can then obviously be blurred out, like Natalie said, with the data that is shared. And it's best to try and use a 6 or an 8 figure grid reference if you can. A couple of other things that you might want to record are things like habitat, behavior. Is the species you're looking at mutated? Is it grown in an unexpected way? Or growing in a location that doesn't make sense for this specific species? Life stage is important. Is it a larva, a chick, an adult? Is it dead? And population as well. So did you see a flock of birds? Was it male? How many were male and how many were female? And just as an example of the why this other information can be useful, this is a photo of a buttercup that I saw at the side of the road. When I picked it up, I didn't recognize it as a buttercup initially, but when I analysed it a bit more, it was clear that it was actually just a mutated version of I think it's a meadow buttercup there. So yeah, it can be really, really interesting, and it's a bit of a fun find, and it's a bit different from the sometimes when you're just recording things and it's like everything you're expecting to see. If you find a mutated species, they can be really interesting. So an example of the information to put in your records: who. So in this instance, this is a record that I've made. So it's my name that's attached to it. What did I see? I seen trumpet lichen, with the Latin name Cladonia fimbriata. When was it observed? The 7th of October at 12:07, but it was submitted the same day, just a minute later, because that was the difference between me checking the ID of what I had and going through the options on iNaturalist is what I used for this, to see that I was happy with what I was seeing. And the 6-figure grid reference for where this observation was. So yeah, it's that simple, and a lot of apps and a lot of the biological recording spreadsheets will prompt you to use these things so that you don't forget. There's a lot of really useful identification apps that are out there, and everyone kind of has the ones that they like. I think it's all of them are fine as long as you're making sure that your records ultimately are getting delivered to the NBN Atlas in your local environmental recording centres. These apps specifically that are on the screen here, they don't submit anything onto the NBN Atlas as far as I'm aware. They're purely to help you with identifying what you're seeing or what you're able to hear. There's so many like free apps out there that cover such a large variety of organisms. So I would really encourage you to explore different ones and see which you prefer. And obviously, of course, there's identification books like Collins, the Collins books and things like that, but that can be very, very cumbersome to carry. The Collins bird guide, fungi guide, mammal guide, all of that can be very cumbersome to carry with you if you're just going out with the intention of recording in a more leisurely sense. And I'm now going to talk about what apps you can use to record what you're seeing. So the previous slide was about identifying the things that are around you, and this is specifically about apps to record those things that you've identified, and how to make sure that they're getting to the NBN Atlas. The two main ones that I'm going to talk about are iNaturalist and iRecord, both of which have been mentioned in the past, and I think Kat's also going to mention them in her presentation, but you can't really mention one without mentioning the other, especially when you're comparing them. So this table kind of divides the two apps into their level, the data being added to the NBN, and the pros and cons. So iNaturalist is very easy to use. It's got an app but also a website, and both are linked, so you can view it on the app and then go onto the website if you need to kind of spend more time with it or you want to kind of look into it a bit more. You can create projects on it, so it's really useful if you're doing bio blitzes, or working on projects with like kids or specific groups. It can be really useful. There's also a more simplistic version of the app called Seek, which is particularly a good tool to use for children and people who have additional support needs. It's quite friendly, and again, it's kind of like, I describe it as Pokemon Go, but for nature. They release challenges every month relating to like what you can expect to see, and if you set the licensing up, that stuff will also get shared to the NBN Atlas, and I've used it in the past with school groups that I take out, and it's been a real hit. So I would definitely explore that a bit more. I'm not going to touch on it too much today. The cons of iNaturalist are that your records do need to have a photograph in order for them to be verified. This can be quite an issue when it comes to birds and birdsong. Yeah, so if it can be useful to help you ID it, but it can be an issue if you don't have a picture. And for a submission to be called research grade, it has to go through two levels. So it gets submitted, and then it needs to have 2 other users agree on the identification in order for that recording to become research grade. So it's like peer reviewing. Once it's reached that research grade and people have agreed, yes, I agree, this is what is in the picture, then it is sent on to the NBN Atlas, as far as I understand. Onto iRecord, its level is aimed a little bit more at expert and intermediate recorders, because you really need to know what you're looking at and before you submit a recording. The pros of iRecord, however, are that your records don't need a photograph. Every record is checked by an official verifier at iRecord, and you can also create projects on the iRecord app. The cons of iRecord, in my opinion, it's not the most user-friendly app. It can be quite complex to navigate if you're stepping into biological recording for the first time. And as I said, you need to know the identification of what you're looking at before you submit your record, but it is a really valuable resource. And again, it's kind of the same with the identification apps. Everyone has certain ones that they prefer for different things. Some people even use a mixture of the two, which I don't really mind, as long as your licensing is set correctly so that it will all get shared with NBN. So just to talk about the licensing on iNaturalist, you just have to go into the website and follow the instructions on the screen. I'm not going to walk you through it step by step. These slides will get shared, and then the information is there for you to go and look at and make sure that you give the correct licensing permissions. So this is the one for iNaturalist, and this is the one for iRecord. So just make sure that you have the licensing listed correctly, so that your data can reach as far as is useful for it. And of course, I'm talking about apps, but pencil and paper is just as good a resource, and a lot less cumbersome and a lot more reliable to use. A lot of different research centres have their own recording sheet that they prefer, but it's all the same basic information. You could even make up one randomly if you wanted to, if you're out and you're like, oh, I should record this. So this one here is actually from the TWIC website, but it's all the same information as before. So date, location, grid reference, as close as you can get it. So this is when you would use your OS locate, species name, common or scientific, any comments, population of what you saw and who's identified it. There then is usually information on the sheet guiding you where to submit this information so that it will then get shared with the NBN Atlas. Recording as part of a community is also a really fun thing, an important thing, I think. You can get all walks of life involved in it, and if people aren't physically able to get out and record, as I mentioned earlier, they can still go online and identify and analyse data that's been found. So TCV do have a weekly group that goes out to sites across central Scotland, mostly the Glasgow side, and they record things for various projects. But in terms of recording in relation to planning developments, get some friends, get some local people from the community, get together and meet once a week for an hour, go for a walk, or there's really so much that you could do. And ideally you would record everything that you see. Sometimes that's not the most fun or realistic way of doing things, but you just want to record as much as you can on your site, and you can get really creative with it as well. It just, yeah, I think more people need to understand the importance of going out as part of a community, and it doesn't have to just be you individually doing it. It can be a group of you standing in a field and walking, you know, ahead and stopping every now and then and recording what you're immediately seeing. The last thing I want to say is, do not wait for a development to be planned in order to start recording things in your area. Start recording now. Data is much stronger when you have year after year examples of what is on a site and what is the standard, in quotes, of a site. If you only start recording once you know that a piece of land is under threat, you are only able to capture, let's say, 6 months of data between you finding out that it's under develop or risk of development. But if you start now, then the foundations of that are much stronger. Record in your garden, record in your town centre, record anything that catches your eye, things that you haven't seen before. Just record is the message I want kind of people to take away from today. And these are all pictures from projects I've been a part of and groups I've been a part of where we've gone out and captured information. So that's me. Thank you for listening. There's some further information with a link to TCV's Citizen Science page, so you can have a look at that if you desire, and a direct link to the MBN Atlas and Mammal Web and Zooniverse are the websites that I mentioned but didn't touch upon. My email is also there if anyone would like to get in touch for anything. Yeah, that's me. I hope that was all coherent. But thank you for having me along to this.
Thank you, Aimée, for that. And now we're going to move on to Cat McKay. And Cat has a medical research, project management and communications background, but she's also developed skills in learning how to record the veteran trees and nature in her own area in Peebles. And her motivation was initially to protect a woodland with veteran trees from a development that would have a very destructive impact. If that is given the go-ahead, well, she's actually on next Monday, it will be happening. So fingers crossed for Cat for that. So Cat's going to explain how to record trees and how recording helps campaigns like the ones at Kings Meadow and all the other benefits of recording too. So thank you very much, Cat. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Claire. And thanks for inviting me to speak as part of this really important webinar series. So I am one of the organisers of the Save Kings Meadows campaign in Peebles in the Scottish Borders. And I'm going to talk about why biological recording matters if you are running a grassroots community campaign like ours. So just to give you a bit of context, Kings Meadows consists of a Georgian mansion, which sits in 17 acres of grounds on the banks of the River Tweed. It's approximately 2/3 mature woodland. The estate is owned by property developers who converted the house into apartments and have further plans to develop in the grounds and also in the woodland itself. So you can see from the video that the woods provide significant connectivity through the town, but also along the river to the wider countryside beyond. So this is a 200-year-old riparian woodland. It's a significant biodiverse habitat with a very large number of veteran and notable trees on site, more of which I will talk about later. So why is recording important? We've already heard in detail about how to do it, but why do you need to do it as a community? And the short and simple answer to that is that we need accurate biological records uploaded to national databases to make sure that the decision-making by the planners is actually based on evidence. A number of groups use these national databases, including scientists and other recording schemes and conservation societies, but for the purposes of today, I want to talk about decision makers, so politicians and planning authorities and developers, and importantly, the ecologists who work for them. So what are these records used for? I asked a SAIM registered chartered ecologist who has helped us a lot with the campaign for his perspective on why recording and why community recording is important and how he uses the databases in his work. And his insights are really quite telling. So firstly, in his opinion, it's biological recording that drives nature conservation in the UK. Without it, observation of species decline could just simply be dismissed as anecdotal, and there would be absolutely no way of persuading politicians the need to protect threatened species and habitats. Robust data on biodiversity decline means we have legislative protection for rare and threatened species, for example, through the Wildlife and Countryside Act. It also means that we can protect the most valuable sites from inappropriate development. On a local level, it allows identification of local biodiversity sites, which Natalie's already touched on, which are meant to be protected by the planning system. The Scottish Biodiversity List identifies habitats and species that ministers consider to be of principal importance for biodiversity conservation in Scotland. How it works, so what an ecologist would do, they'd start by consulting something like TWIC or NBN, for example, to identify notable species, both on the site and also adjacent to development sites. They do this by providing a grid reference to TWIC with a buffer zone, so 500 meters to 2 kilometers, depending on the site of the size of the development site. If notable species have already been recorded or are adjacent to the site, it allows the ecologist to focus on these species when undertaking the site survey, and it also helps them to inform the ecological input to the design of the development, and if necessary, a mitigation hierarchy, which should follow these steps in this order. So in his opinion, this means doing everything possible to avoid losing biodiversity in the first place before deciding to deliver some kind of mitigation or restoration project or compensatory planting, for example, for loss of biodiversity. So that desk study, which is their sort of first port of call, forms part of what's called a preliminary ecological appraisal, which also includes a physical survey of the site. And PEAs are useful because they provide a rapid assessment of ecological features and species. So what is the significance of that? So according to SAIM's Guide to Ecological Surveys, a PEA can help the project proposer, so the developer, or another, and the planning authority in scoping the subsequent ecological impact assessment, or in concluding that ecological issues won't be significant in determining the application and no further survey work is required. Now that really, really matters. If there is no biological record for a species or biological records at all for your site, then it's going to be so much easier for a developer or a planning authority to come to that conclusion that the ecological issues won't be significant. And they might even decide that further surveys like an ECIA or an EIA are not needed when it comes to determining the application for the site. Conversely, if there are robust biological records, then developers and planners in particular who have a duty of care must take these records into account to protect important species. Recording is also important for you as a community and very, very useful. Firstly, in designing and driving a campaign. In my experience, the public really cares about their local environment, and you can get massive traction for your campaign if you can show the level of biodiversity on site and why it needs to be protected. Records also add strength to community objections. If it's known, for example, in our case, that there are European protected species on site or veteran trees, you can write far stronger material objections against a planning application. Records are also useful in other ways. If you think a site is sensitive, but it's not listed as a local biodiversity site, you can request records for the area from a body like TWIC, and you can then use that data to try and influence the local development plan during the public consultation period. For example, by proposing the site as a local biodiversity site. And we are just about to test this in practice by getting our site or proposing our site as a local biodiversity site. And I just want to end on a quote from my friend, the ecologist that I spoke to. He said, if we don't have species data provided by volunteer recorders through ad hoc recording or more formal recording schemes, then the whole nature conservation system breaks down. So what you do as a community and as individuals by recording, going out and doing voluntary recording is really, really important. NPF4 was covered in last year's webinars, particularly in the one titled NPF4, How Things Have Changed. I think there's going to be a link to that. I would really urge you to go back and watch them. And I'm not going to say too much about NPF4 because of that, but I will briefly mention Policy 6 because it relates directly to recording trees for the Woodland Trust Ancient Tree Inventory, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So during the consultation process on NPF4, the Woodland Trust lobbied and campaigned very hard to introduce specific wording on ancient woodlands and veteran trees into Policy 6. And that policy states, development proposals will not be supported where they result in any loss of ancient woodlands, ancient and veteran trees, or adverse impact on their ecological condition. Policy 6 also says that development proposals involving woodland removal will only be supported where they will achieve significant and clearly defined additional public benefits. So it should be assuring, right? When it comes to woodlands in general, and ancient woodlands in particular, and veteran trees, there should always be a presumption against their removal, or there needs to be at least clear public benefit for the development. Unfortunately, making that happen might be a different story in practice, which is where the ATI comes in. So the ATI is a map of Britain's oldest and most important trees. It currently lists over 160,000 trees, but there are thousands and possibly hundreds of thousands more to add. And because of that, the ATI is dependent on the public to record these trees. So what are they? So on the right-hand side in the middle are two trees that I recorded here at Kings Meadows. The ancient tree on the left, I got from the picture from the internet because we don't have any ancient trees on site, unfortunately. An ancient tree is in its third or its final stage of life. For some species, that can go on for centuries, in some cases millennia. They're often, but not always, huge, especially the girth of the tree. They're interesting aesthetically because they stand out in the local landscape and potentially culturally. So, for example, they might be mentioned in historic records. Veteran trees are usually only in their second stage of life. They can be ancient, but not always. They're sexually mature, but because they're not ancient doesn't mean that they're not important and that we shouldn't be recording them. They have many of the features of ancient trees. The greatest value of both ancient and veteran trees is obviously their biodiversity. They support a huge range of fauna and fungi, many of which are only associated with long periods of continuity in the habitat. So you're not going to replace that biodiversity by doing some compensatory planting in a field. Notable trees are usually mature trees, but they're not veteran and they're not ancient. They're important often because they stand out in the local environment. Maybe they're in a park or in the middle of a town, so they're important to the local population. They're still worthy of recognition, which is why the ATI records them, not least because they might be starting to develop features that are important for biodiversity, which is the case here at Kings Meadows. So the first step in recording these trees is to find them. And in my experience, once you know what you're looking for, you just start to see them everywhere. Often veteran trees are very tall or very wide, but size isn't everything and is very species dependent. So on the left and in the middle, we have the same two trees at Kings Meadows, both roughly the same height and the same girth, but one is a veteran and the other one is a notable tree. On the right is an ancient hawthorn, which is a couple of kilometers away. It's not here. It's much older, but it's also much, much smaller. So other things to look for, other than size in that case, are all of the features that make these important for biodiversity. So, for example, that is holes and cavities in the trunk and branches of the tree, hollow trunks. If you look at the tree on the right-hand side, you can see that the trunk is starting to hollow out and the heartwood is completely exposed. It has quite a lot of evidence of insect activity, which is the reason it was given veteran status despite being relatively young for an oak tree. These features are all excellent for biodiversity because they provide essential habitat for all kinds of creatures. Other features to look for, so deadwood in the canopy or on the ground around the tree. Standing deadwood, the tree in the middle of the slide is a veteran tree, even though it's dead. The biodiversity value of deadwood cannot be overstated, so don't be put off from recording a dead tree. Look for water pockets at the base of the trees. These provide essential drinking water for mammals and birds. Look for evidence of insects and fungi. You don't need to know what the species are, you just need to know that there is evidence and preferably provide pictures of that evidence. Look for evidence of bats, for example, staining around holes and cavities, which is could signify bat urine. Look for epiphytes, so things like moss and lichen on the trunks of the tree, ferns and cuckoo trees growing in the canopy. I'm not going to go into any detail about how to record the trees. There's extensive information on how to do this on ATI's website, including lots of videos that you can watch. I've included some links here and in the resource list at the end of my talk, and I'm really happy to answer any questions about this at the end. I have some top tips about getting trees verified quickly once you start. Again, I'm not going to go into these in too much detail, but this will be in the resources. But notify the ATI. Don't wait for them to just find your record on the ATI website. Email them and tell them that you've done it, and ask them to verify it. Try and find out who your local verifier is. Usually it's a local volunteer that lives somewhere in your area. And if you can find out who they are and get their contact details, they're much more responsive than the ATI themselves. Provide detailed and accurate records, and all of the information on how to do that is there on the website. Once a verifier gets to know you and gets to trust your records, providing you provide enough detail, they can do remote verification, which really speeds up the process. What I do want to show you is how the tree surveying evolved at Kingsmeadows. So in February 2021, we'd already fought off one application for housing in the woodland, and we were facing another one, and we realized we needed to do something. We started with a pilot survey by reading up on how to do it on the website, and then identifying some likely candidates. And that led to the ATI verifying 5 of the trees as veterans and 2 as notables. We carried on over the course of the next year, and that added 2 more veteran trees and a further 34 notables to the tally. And then we completed the process in 2023 with 91 trees recorded. So this woodland now has the highest density of recorded trees on the ATI anywhere in our locality. You know, it's a really significant woodland. And although only 10 of them are veterans, many of the notable trees were given that status because they're already developing features of veteran trees. These trees are our next generation of veteran trees, and just like ancient and veteran trees, they are not replaceable by compensatory planting. I want to just touch on iRecord very briefly because I realize I'm running out of time. These are my records on iRecord, and I just want to highlight a couple of things. So all biological records are important. We all know this. But as far as the law is concerned, not all records are created equal. So if, like us, for example, and you have European and nationally protected species on the site, then getting them verified, getting verified records of these is critical, but it's not necessarily easy. I live on site, and this is my garden fence. So by sheer luck, I was able to take a picture of a red squirrel from my office window. But as Aimée has already mentioned, you don't always need a picture of the animal or the record itself. I've actually had 2 otter sightings verified from pictures of spraint alone and a detailed description. And for iRecord, you don't necessarily need a picture at all. I've had other red squirrel sightings and a water vole sighting verified based on my written descriptions. And I'm just going to end on this. NPF 4 Policy 3 states that development proposals will contribute to the enhancement of biodiversity, including where relevant, restoring degraded habitats and building and strengthening nature networks. In other words, mitigation is no longer acceptable, and moving forward, development proposals should be enhancing biodiversity, especially in a site like ours. Unfortunately, it's my experience that communities are going to have to apply the right kind of pressure on developers and on planners to make sure these policies get enforced. Having accurate records is a big step towards that, but you need to record proactively, as Aimée has already said. When an application hits, communities have got 3 weeks usually to respond, which is just way too late to be doing any recording. So start recording now, record regularly, record throughout the year, and make sure that the next time a developer comes to do a survey in your area, there are records there that they can't ignore. And just a final word to end on a note of optimism. If you are involved in environmental action, it seems like things just get harder every year. But if you go out and record, it gives you a real feeling of empowerment that you're doing something practical. There's a huge satisfaction learning something new. It's fun and it makes you happy. I really can't recommend it enough. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Kat. That was really informative. And together, I think with those 3 talks, I'm hoping everybody will be much better armed to go out and record. We will be, as Kat pointed out in the chat, we will be having an in-person session, and hopefully we will try and organise some in-person sessions and some training sessions for people next year. So keep watching the webinars, keep going to our websites, and if you for Planning Democracy, if you go onto our newsletter section and then sign up for our newsletters, we can inform you of any future events coming up, and we'll try and send you some in the chat. I think most of the questions were answered in the chat. I was running out, I was trying to find some of the questions that hadn't been answered. One that I think might not have been answered is, how do you find out who your local verifier is? Would anybody like to answer that? I think somebody's been having problems.
I can answer that because I think it's about the ATI. I'm just looking at the question. So when you email the ATI at the email address that I provided to let them know that you've uploaded the records, just ask them who it is. In my case, they actually CC'd them on the response to me to tell me that they'd verified some of the trees. So that's how I found out who it was. And now I just deal with him directly. Whenever I need a tree verified, I just ping him and he does it very quickly because he now trusts that my records are accurate. So
there was also around bat roosts and what's the protocol for if a neighbour's property is marked for excessive development, and I presume that was answered, Laura, with about, it was mostly about access, but you're talking about bat roosts being there, and would you submit those to iRecord? Does anybody have any comments about that? Maybe even about concerns about them getting rid of the bat roosts. That's something that's happened in a couple of applications we've seen. And I don't know if Natalie, you would have anything to say about that at all.
Sure, yes. So you certainly can record it, but that's if it's an active planning application, it's probably going to be too late. So you're probably better off speaking to the local authority biodiversity officer or ecologist, whoever's dealing with the application, and they should follow it up because it would effectively be a wildlife crime if say it's a tree with a known bat roost, if they were to fell that tree and there's evidence that there is a roost, because it's protected throughout the year, even if it's not currently with bats in the roost. So yeah, speak to the local authority biodiversity officer directly.
Nikki, you and I were talking about a question that came up as well that you were thinking about. Did you want to say anything about that question that you were talking about with me this morning? I think it came up from somebody.
Thanks, Claire. I think it's really been answered. It was a question that I was out for a walk with friends, and we saw a short-eared owl up near the Pentlands, and somebody managed to take a photograph of it. We weren't quite sure what species it was at the time and whether it was worth uploading it with somebody else's photograph from 3 weeks ago, but it sounds like it probably could, even though it's quite a good photo actually. And we did speak to several ecologists afterwards to make sure we were right. But I think, yeah, it's been answered, Claire.
Okay, does anybody have any comments about that, Natalie?
Yeah, all I just say with photos, the photo should relate to the sighting that you upload it with. So if it was from 3 weeks prior, your record details should be for that sighting, not the follow-up sighting, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it was just the one sighting.
That's what I would say.
It's just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, but photos are useful because they definitely help the verifiers confirm or otherwise. Yeah.
I have some experience of that, Nikki, because I have uploaded sightings that other residents on the estate have made, and I use their pictures. I get the date and the time, and if I can, the location from them, and I just mention in the notes of the record when I'm up before I upload it that it was somebody else's sighting and that I'm just recording it on their behalf.
Okay. Oh, that's useful. Thank you.
That's a marvellous end to what has been a really informative evening. Thank you so much to our speakers, Natalie, Aimée and Kat. So thank you everybody for coming. And don't forget that we've got another webinar on the 15th of January, and that one's going to be about nature networks. And we've got 3 speakers again for that.
Thank you to you, Claire, for an amazing bringing this together, and all the speakers. And if the speakers and organisers want to stay on just for a couple of minutes afterwards for a thank you, that would be great. But everyone else can go. Bye. Bye, everybody. Bye.